these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
For insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
We hold these truths.
with Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Hey everybody, welcome back. We've got an awesome episode today. It's with Frank Luntz, and he is a legend when it comes to polling and messaging in politics. Dr. Frank Luntz. He's one of the most honored and really famous communication professionals in America today. He has instant response focus group, and he's been on 60 Minutes, Good Morning America, Frontline recently. He's been on The Daily Show, Real Time with Bill Maher, Meet the Press, Nightline, The Today Show, PBS News Hour, and Face the Nation, among many, many others. He's always on TV regularly, HBO, Fox News, you name it. You've got a really long profile here. Needless to say, you know what you're talking about, Frank, and we appreciate you being on the show.
Well, I got to be candid with you, which is I've always told people I feel like an idiot, and the reason that I work so hard is to become less of an idiot. The reason why I do so many interviews, the reason why I do so many focus groups, the reason why I'm always asking questions is that I'm so afraid of getting it wrong that I want to understand how people think. I want to understand how they process information. I want to understand their biases. And so while I appreciate that introduction, just know that I feel dumber today than I ever have in my life, unfortunately.
But why is that? Is that because you don't, is it harder and harder to understand why people are behaving the way they are? Like, what do you mean by that?
It's that I realize all that I don't know.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to figure it out. I'm in a desperate search, a pursuit of the truth, which does not make me a fan, does not make what I believe necessarily. I get criticized on the left. I get criticized on the right. I can't be pro-Trump enough for people who love him. I can't be anti-Trump enough for people who hate him. Republicans criticize me. Democrats criticize me because I don't believe in the end that we can have one ideology and one solution and one set of, I do believe there's a right and a wrong, but I'm not convinced that I know what that is. And the older that I get, the more humble I become, the more respectful I become of people like you who have life experiences that I could never understand. And it has changed the way I thought. When I was 30 years old, I absolutely knew what I believed, and I knew what was right and wrong. Now that I'm heading very quickly towards 60, I'm not convinced of anything anymore.
That's interesting. And lately you've talked a lot about divisiveness and how dangerous that is for our country. And obviously you've been doing this for a long time. You've been putting these focus groups together for how many years?
The first focus group I ever did was, I even remember it, was back in 1988.
Wow.
I did it in Hartford, Connecticut. I was a lot younger then, a lot thinner then. And this is long before I did one on television, long before they became relatively well known. But I knew it. I knew the moment I sat down with the voters, the moment that I sat down with Americans, and I've done it all across the globe, I knew that that was the way that I needed to gather information. I needed to hear it from people themselves, what they really thought, not just what they told people on the telephone.
Well, what I want to ask you is you've made a pretty big note that it's more divisive now than ever. You're sounding the alarm on this pretty consistently. And I want to understand how you know that. And I guess there's two ways to answer that. And one is, what kind of language are people using that is different? What kind of behavior that you see in focus groups anecdotally that is different than before? And two, is there a way to actually measure divisiveness? Is there a more scientific way that we can look at how people are divided as in 2020 versus the year 2000?
Well, I was involved. I go back to 1992 and Ross Perot. And I do believe that there's a way to measure it, and I've done it statistically as well as through this qualitative process. And statistically, you ask people a question. Not only do they think that they're right, but do they think that their opponents are trying to destroy the country, trying to separate the parties from each other? Is there an active attempt to block cooperation? And people say yes, and they all blame the other side. Mm-hmm. And I know from the sessions that I've been doing that they were erupting in people tearing each other apart, being rude to each other, using language I would never dare use on this recording. And it would take minutes instead of hours. It would be at the drop of a hat. It's not that people wanted to speak, it's that they wanted to be heard, but they did not want to listen. So we now have a significant segment of the population that is so eager to speak and so resistant of listening that I don't know how we're ever going to get anything done. And on a national basis, you and I could name a half dozen people, and some of them you may like, that are determined to put out a point of view without any challenge, without any exception, without any modification. And I think that's dangerous to the political system.
But I guess my question is, how has it changed? Isn't that the nature of politics to an extent, to convince people that you are right and to constantly be giving them, I guess, evidence for the fact that your policy or your ideology is the correct one by which to govern the country?
But you just gave the key word: evidence, facts, statistics.
Right.
Back
there's a way to fight properly, and there's a way to just insult the other side.
Correct. And there's a way to be factual. And I grew up in a time of William F. Buckley and Gene Kirkpatrick and Richard Pearl and frankly, Ronald Reagan. When I grew up, when I was forming my political beliefs, my side was the smart side. My side was the intellectual side. My side came out of James Q. Wilson came out of an intellectual approach which championed freedom over collectivism. Mm-hmm. But it did not assert, it proved. It did not yell, it convinced. And it really did know the facts. And it was well presented. Firing line, which a few of your listeners will remember, but a lot of them won't. We had the smart people. And I don't feel like that's happening as much anymore. I feel like we've, on both sides, we've perfected how to name call. Yeah. We haven't perfected how to debate.
Yeah, I think that's true. Well, here's how I would push back. I think we have plenty of smart people. And I'm more and more excited as I see younger conservatives start to take the mantle. People my age that I have a deep respect for, and I think really understand the philosophical underpinnings of conservatism in a serious way. You know, I'm thinking about somebody like Ben Shapiro, for instance, and others. We didn't have that maybe throughout the 2000s. It doesn't seem like to me, or at least I'm not sure who they were, maybe because I wasn't super politically involved. I guess the problem is a cultural problem where we don't elevate those people high enough. Now, well, Ben's not a great example because he is elevated pretty highly in the conservative movement. But what is most likely to happen is a good sophisticated point made on Twitter gets some likes, right? Like not a whole lot, maybe it gets some traction, but some kind of own, whether it's owning the cons or owning the libs, man, that one takes off, you know? And so it's like this cultural feedback and I guess I'm describing social media. So in your research, how is the birth of social media changed the way you see people interact with each other in focus groups, or has it?
It's been awful. I think it's the primary cause of why our learned conversations are now sound bites and shorter. and you speak of being owned. That's the goal.
Yeah, it is.
The fact is, a negative tweet about someone or something is 3 times more likely to be forwarded than a positive tweet. It is almost 4 times more likely to be remembered. If you give people a set of 25 statements, half negative, half positive, they are 4 times more likely to remember the negative statements. So we are, by our human behavior and by our study of this, we're actually encouraging this bad behavior. And my concern is that we have a greater degree of bullying now than we've ever had. We are more likely, kids are more likely to act out of class. I think that we are losing that thing that made us, and I know this is not what you were expecting from me, but I've had the time to do the research. And to those people who are listening, I'm passing on a warning to them that American exceptionalism is not based just on a free market economy. It's not based just on a strong defense and an upholding of a set of morals and values. It is also based on how we treat each other. And even if we disagree, that is not an excuse or it's not a defense to tear down what we don't believe in. We are at our strongest when we have this debate over ideas. American exceptionalism, I think, hit its peak under Ronald Reagan. And I think that we are too willing to allow people to express themselves in an ugly way simply because we agree with them and disagree with the other side.
Yeah, that rings pretty true. You know what I really wanted to ask you, because I saw this on a talk you gave where you mentioned populism and as it being a great way to get elected, but not so great a way to govern. I think this is a fascinating topic because people talk about populism but rarely define it. So how do you think of populism and what and why is it a bad way to govern?
So this is a epiphany that I've come to over the last year and a half, and I've seen it take place in Europe, in France, in Germany, in some of the Eastern European countries that frankly are moving very fast away from democracy. And it's about punishing those who you don't agree with in society. It is about, it's hard to define because it's different in different countries,
right?
And it's different in different electorates.
I agree, and I think when the left likes to call Trump supporters populists, they're really trying to tie those supporters to, I think, a more ethno-nationalist populism of, say, Eastern Europe, and I don't think that's fair. I think it's more of a politics. I think in the U.S. it kind of manifests in sort of this politics of resentment, and like you said, just kind of, I don't care who the other side is. I just want my side to beat them. And I wonder if that is the best way to define it.
But I want to speak in favor, and I did this going back 3 years ago. What attracted me to Donald Trump was that he spoke for people who felt like their voice had been silenced. He spoke for people who had either been ignored for decades or forgotten. People who didn't live in the urban areas. People who were not served by the New York Times or the Washington Post. People who had worked hard, played by the rules, and had fallen through the cracks.
Mm-hmm.
And it was not as much about Trump himself, but about those people who we have been telling them that the American dream is alive and well, and yet they didn't feel it for themselves, and they were afraid they weren't going to get it for their kids and the next generation. I feel for them. I respect them so much. These are people who do not take a government check. These are people who are not fighting for a bailout. These are people who have been willing to pay their taxes, and all they ask is that their money be spent wisely and carefully, and that their elected officials be held accountable. But they haven't seen any of that. And so they got fed up, and they voted for dramatic change in 2016. I deeply respect their effort because they have lived everything we asked of them, but they have too often been left behind.
Yeah, and I would agree with you, but I wouldn't call them populists either. I have a real hard time trying to define that term. And I just asked about it because it is thrown away. It's thrown around quite a bit. And we never define it properly, except to say that maybe it's a basic revolt against elites, and maybe that does describe what you just said.
Well, it's on the left too. It's the people who voted for Bernie Sanders.
Right.
I went out in this 2020 campaign. I didn't stay in Washington or New York. I went out to Iowa. I went out to New Hampshire. I went out to South Carolina and the Super Tuesday states. And I listened to them. And a lot of the people who voted for, my shock, by the way, is that there are some people who voted for Bernie Sanders that considered voting for or did vote for Donald Trump in 2016.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hillary Clinton was the establishment candidate. Trump and Sanders were the candidates of change.
Yeah, let's talk about those people. That is so hard for me to understand. It's so difficult for me to understand somebody who can vote for Trump and Bernie, just because the governing principles and the policies that either of these men would implement are so vastly different. And I mean, how do you explain that? Like, what does your research show?
Because it's not necessarily about the policies, and it's very much about the tone. It's about the hostility towards the status quo and the belief that things that were promised have not been delivered. So it's really not whether we have Medicare for all, mm-hmm. or whether we have a free market health system. It's really not about whether we have NAFTA or some sort of trade policy or that we are fair traders.
So does that just mean that it is the politics of resentment then? Because if it's just about sticking it to somebody, and you said something that I really wanted, that really stuck out for me, which is the promises that are unfulfilled. And this gets to what I talk about a lot, which is politicians have been over-promising for a very long time. The easiest way to get elected is to promise you the world, to promise you your utopia, to promise that you're going to get more power, that especially over another group. I mean, that gets into identity politics. Is that maybe what the cause of this horrible resentment is? Because there is resentment. I mean, I don't know how else to describe what some people feel. And maybe that's, and sometimes it's totally justified, but I'm not convinced that every time it is. I'm not convinced that everybody's anger is always justified. And you have to look at each case objectively. But is it also because as politicians, I don't say we because I just got into this business, I'm not going to take blame for it. But over the years, that over promising, I mean, it leads people down the wrong path.
So I'm going to turn this around and ask you a question and say, I'm a pollster. Mm-hmm. You're a smart guy. You're one of the smartest members up there, even if you haven't been in for a long time. You know how much money the country has. You understand what this spending is doing. We know that people are hurting out there, but we also know how much it's costing us.
Yeah.
We're going to pass another one, or I should say you guys are going to pass another one. Who's going to tell the American people about the debt that we are running up? Who's going to be straight with them about how much this is going to cost taxpayers? That you can print money only for so long before you start inflation and before you debase your own currency when a dollar isn't worth a dollar anymore.
Yeah.
I'm watching both sides, and I'm curious to see which is the side that's going to say, okay, we have to do this because people are hungry and they're unemployed. But this is how much it's going to cost. I haven't heard a single politician, none of them, address the cost.
I would say that's not true. I have. I mean, I personally have, just because I've said it. But in a widespread way, no, you are correct. It's happened on the fringes. I think, people like me have said, listen, this is on interviews. I've said many times, This is why you can't have a big debt, because sometimes you do have to spend the money, right? And this is one of those times. Sometimes there's an emergency and you have to spend the money, and you can't have a giant debt that really makes it, inhibits you from being able to spend in emergency situations. Here's the problem going forward. Who's going to be honest about how to actually rein in that debt? So once this crisis subsides and we get a vaccine in a year, and coronavirus is this weird part of our history that's symbolized by Tiger King and toilet paper, looking back, but and it's going to be weird. But then looking forward, okay, how do we get out of this debt problem? Well, we know how. You and I know exactly how, right? It's mandatory spending. That's the only answer. It really is. It's the only part as a share of GDP. It's the only thing that radically changes. The taxes we take in as revenue don't radically change. Our discretionary spending actually continues to go down as a share of GDP. Only one thing is to blame for our spending problem and our debt problem. But again, this is kind of where populism starts to creep back in, depending on how we define it. If I tell that to conservatives or liberals, well, they accuse me of taking things from them. Why? Because we overpromised. And, for decades and decades, our government overpromised to people. And then the government says, hey, guys, this isn't actually a sustainable program. Or a bold, let's say not the government, but a bold politician like myself might say, hey, this isn't sustainable. And we've got to make hard decisions. You guys want to make some hard decisions? No. That's the answer. The answer is no. So we can blame our elites all we want. But the reality is we're all in this together. And we all voted on these things, and we all don't want to change them. So it's I don't even know what question I was just answering there, but
no, I want to applaud what you just said, and I want to challenge the people who will listen to this to hold their elected officials on all sides, on all levels, accountable. Right now I'm holed up in California. We already have an income tax rate of 13.3%. There's no sales tax coming in. There's nothing being sold, so there's limited real estate taxes. We are going to face a statewide shortfall because this state has no revenue, and it is putting out money that it does not have. Is anyone going to stand up and say what the cost is going to be? I think we're going to have an even greater percentage of that so-called populism as more and more people say it's just too much. I can't afford it. People were leaving California for Arizona, for Colorado, for Nevada, for Texas over the last 5-10 years. I think you're going to see a mass exodus starting next year, when taxes are going to go up to 15% or even higher.
Oh, I love California. I spent 10 years there, but it's the policies there are just devastating, and they're not sustainable. Well, let's stay on that topic of how, and I want to ask you, what is the right language to use? I don't know if you've done any research on this already. But what do you think the right language is to use as we try to make the case for reopening the economy? I've written about this. I just had an op-ed published in The Hill. I'm writing another one now on how this plan would look. What does it mean to pull out of this sort of tactical retreat, as I call it, and move into offense against the pandemic and fighting the pandemic alongside opening an economy? I think we can do both. What are you seeing in the public? I mean, how can we talk about that and relieve people's fears?
Well, I'll throw out a couple ideas for you. I think it should start with respect for hardworking taxpayers. And that is to tell people the truth, to emphasize that they can handle it, that this is America and we have overcome situations like this in the past. But it begins not by a handout, but it begins by respecting hardworking taxpayers, to restore rather than to give. I have a problem with legislation that actually encourages you, and you try to get this out of there, and you succeeded for the most part, but not completely.
Yeah.
That there are still some areas where it actually pays you to be unemployed rather than to go back to work.
Yeah, depending on what state you're in, it's a frustrating part of the bill.
And I know Republicans did everything they could to remove that, and they fought over it. But why? It's hard to explain to people why they should be giving more when this money is going to resettle refugees or bailing out NPR, which can get donations. It's a perfectly good organization, but it should be private, or the Kennedy Center. That how do you expect people to return to the way things are, or to go back and essentially sacrifice when you're taking their hard-earned money and spending it on pet projects of the people in Washington? I'm just hoping that it will, number one, is respect for hardworking taxpayers. Number two is leveling with the American people and actually speaking of it that way. And number three is that we have done this before and we will do it again because we are Americans. Appeal to that exceptional nature of us. We still feel that way. We're losing it, but we still feel that way. And I think it's a good way for us to reach out to each other.
Yeah, I think so. And we have to give ourselves the space to have that debate. What I wrote about was how easy it is to say something like, oh, well, how many lives is it worth to save a job? And what a quick way to end the conversation, you know, but that's so typical of our current political atmosphere. And the unfortunate thing I've seen in the coronavirus epidemic is that terrible, toxic public discourse has seeped its way into crisis, and where we need it the least, right? Because I mean, I can't imagine a more disingenuous question to ask. It's not the right question to ask, because it takes. It's moralizing in the worst of ways. You know, it's like me saying, well, I want to save 40,000 lives a year, so I'm going to stop people from driving. And if you think people should drive, then you think 40,000 people should die.
Right, then you're a murderer.
Yeah.
I watched James Carville, who I know on a private basis, and I was really disappointed when he said about Trump or about some of his people, they have blood on their hands. That deliberate attempt, it's awful. But I'm going to raise something with you that does need to be raised. But it's the whole issue. And it is so dangerous. But what the hell? There are a higher percentage in New York and in other urban areas of African Americans being affected by COVID-19. And I already see the conversations. Why is it the case? Why is the black population 11 or 12% of the country, but they make up 30% of the victims of the virus? We know that there is inequality in health. We also know that there are multi-generational families, more like the African-American community is more likely to have multi-generations, more likely to live in smaller spaces, and that they are more likely to have pre-existing conditions such as diabetes. So we know these things. How are we going to have this conversation? And the other thing was the issue of social distancing, which the Surgeon General took a lot of guts to say it. But he said to his own community, stop screwing around. That your grandmother, your grandfather is in jeopardy. Take it seriously. Are we going to be able to have this conversation? And I'm so afraid that we can't.
Oh, we definitely can't. I mean, you saw the interchange between that reporter and the Surgeon General. The reporter had no good intentions in questioning him. Now, he handled it just unbelievably great, and anybody listening should look up that clip. He handled it in the best, most compassionate way possible. But you have to allow facts to enter the conversation. And when people want to assume that there's some kind of injustice and oppression going on, they will not let facts get in the way. One of the greatest books ever written, that's a huge thing to say. It's a great book, okay? Thomas Sowell's Discrimination and Disparities. And
Yes.
it goes into just excruciating detail on so many issues that are truly facing Americans, of issues of disparity and inequality. Well, let's not even say inequality. I think disparity is the right word. People's outcomes are different. The thing is, when people's outcomes are different, opportunists would like to assume that they are different because of some kind of injustice leveled against them. But then the objective, reasonable person then asks, well, is that true? Just a simple question. Is that true? I mean, what are the factors that led to this outcome? And one of my favorite statistics that he points out is that firstborn children are overwhelmingly more likely to be successful in a really big way, like not by a couple percentage points, but by many, many, many multitudes of percentage points, like more likely to become a member of Congress, more likely to get a better education, more likely to just be more successful along a lot of different lines. I'd have to pull up the book to give you all the examples, but it's really unbelievable. So how is it that you can have such different outcomes from people who had the exact same upbringing? You know, and then to assume that any outcome is the result of some kind of injustice. And so those same questions have to be asked here. And it's in the Surgeon General answered those questions. Of course, it's more likely that the Black community has comorbidities that make their health outcomes worse when diagnosed with coronavirus. And objectively speaking, like you said, if you're in a low income place, it's more likely that you're in closer contact with other people. The question then becomes, okay, what do we do about that? And if the answer is, well, help people get richer, and encourage better diet and exercise and better, and as the Surgeon General said, more responsibility over your health, then let's do that. But the problem with that conversation was the accusation that somebody is doing something malevolent, instead of just having a conversation about, okay, well, how do we solve this? You know, that would be a healthy conversation to have, and we would like to have it. And of course, Republicans and Democrats have different ideas about how to improve people's health and how to improve people's economic standing. But then let's debate that instead of starting the conversation in this place where we're trying to, accuse somebody of racism. I think that's the unfortunate part about that conversation that you just laid out.
So I have a way to wrap this up, because it's something that we all agree on, whether we are conservative or liberal, whether we live in the Northeast or the Southwest, whether we are 25 or 75. And that is, the better informed we are, the stronger the society we have. The more educated we are, the easier it is to exchange information and to learn viewpoints other than our own. If we have a civil society that is a well-educated society, there's no challenge that we cannot meet. But if we are uneducated and uncivil to each other, which is where we seem to be heading right now, there is no challenge that we will be able to solve, because we won't have the skills to do it, we won't have the information or the facts to do it, and we won't have the will to do it. And that is why you being in Congress, you being a participant, is so essential. And I have to say this to every new member, because they think to themselves, what did I get myself into? You got to stick it out. You're a hero to so many. I want to see you successful. I want to see your voice spread, so that people realize that there are many good people representing them. And that's why I agreed to participate in this conversation, because you're a hero to me.
I appreciate it, Frank. The people are hungry for more. That's why these podcasts getting so popular, because they like to hear long form conversations. So we're going to have you back on, because I just know that listeners right now are thinking, wait, no, ask him some more questions. We've got a lot to talk about. So we're going to have you back on.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I appreciate all the work you've done. Fascinating discussion. And you didn't commit to it right now, but we'll get you back on. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Frank.
I can't say no to you, so you know that.
No, appreciate it.